Shabbat Shalom. You all probably know the story that's told about the first Jewish president. His mother is sitting in the crowd next to all the dignitaries, the senators, the justices, the ambassadors, and she nudges the Supreme Court justice next to her and she says, "You see that man up there?" "Yes." "That man about to be sworn in as President of the United States?" "Yes, yes." "That man who's going to be the next leader of the free world?" "Yes, yes." So, "Well, his brother's a doctor." But what do we actually know about the relationship between Judaism and the healing arts that made the president's mother kvel so much? This week's Parsha is an interesting springboard from which to consider the relationship between Judaism and the medical arts. We'll talk about that a bit today. Much of today's Parsha is about the many ways in which a person can become ritually impure through childbirth, menstruation, and inopportune ejaculation, and through various skin conditions, including what is called in the Parsha Tza'arat, commonly translated as leprosy. We learn from a play on words in the Talmud that Tza'arat could be contracted by speaking Lashon Hara. Reish Lakish says, "What is that which is written? This shall be the law of the leper." This means that this shall be the law of the defamer, Motzei Shem Ra. Metzorah, Motzei Shem Ra. The Parsha tells us that one of the laws of Tza'arat is that the Metzorah should be placed under quarantine, that is, temporarily separated from the community. Reish Lakish, who was one of the Amoraim, which are the rabbis who lived between the 3rd and 5th centuries, who wrote the Gemara, commentary on the Mishnah and the Talmud, they explain that because the offender's words have separated people, the offender now must feel physical separation. But separating the Metzorah from the community is not solely a form of metaphorical punishment. It is also a matter of public health. The priest is required to examine the afflicted person's skin to determine whether the lesion is merely impure, in which case presumed to be temporary, or fully leprous, a far more serious and lasting condition. If merely impure, the person must be separated for 7 days so as not to afflict others. If the priest determines that the skin has not cleared by the end of that week, the person is separated for another 7 days. We know this kind of quarantine all too well from recent COVID events. But if the priest determines the infection to be leprous, the person must be banished and expelled from the community. The person can petition for re-entry only if and when the affliction fully heals. The rules governing all this, set out in today's Parsha, are extremely detailed and very complex, and they certainly require the priest to be an adept diagnostician. By setting out these rules to combat contagion, Tazria demonstrates a positive relationship between Judaism and medicine. In fact, long before Hippocrates developed the basic principles of what would become Western medicine, the Torah depicted Moses as an agent of healing. In Bamidbar 21:9, for example, the people complained bitterly to Moses about the hardships of life in the desert. God, really annoyed at this ingratitude, sent down serpents that bit and killed many Israelites. When the people repented and Moses intervened on their behalf, God instructed Moses to fashion a serpent out of copper. If an Israelite suffered a snake bite, that person would look at the copper serpent that Moses had formed and be healed. For that reason, Moses came to be considered a healer in later Midrashic and Aggadic texts. Of course, there are many, many instances in Tanakh of priests and prophets acting as healers. Indeed, centuries before the Gospel of John tells of Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead, The prophets Elijah and Elisha had already done so. The book of Kings tells of 3 such instances. Elijah first performed the miracle of raising the dead in 1 Kings chapter 17. The widow of Sarepta's son became ill and died, prompting Elijah to intercede with God. Elijah stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to God, Adonai Elohai, let this child's life return to his body. God heard Elijah's plea and the child returned to life, demonstrating the community God's power and God's choice of Elijah as prophet and healer. In 2 Kings chapter 4, the prophet Elisha also performs what seems to be a resurrection, but with an interesting medical twist. When a certain Shunammite woman's son died suddenly, she sought Elisha's help. We read that Elisha climbed onto the bed, placed himself over the child, put his mouth on the child's mouth, his eyes on the child's eyes, and his hand on the child's hand. Elisha prayed to God, and the child sneezed 7 times. Why 7? Who knows? And opened his eyes. The miracle, which might just be the first documented evidence of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, affirmed Elisha as Elijah's prophetic and medical successor. Also in 2 Kings, in chapter 13, we read that Elisha's healing abilities remained potent even after his death. When marauding Moabites came through the land, the people had to flee for their lives. Because there was no time to bury a man who recently had died, the people threw the man into the grave where Elisha's bones lay. Upon coming into contact with Elisha's bones, the man returned to life. Thus, Judaism for millennia has been deeply engaged with the concept of healing, so much so that an agent of God can restore the dead to life. Indeed, as we know, the last of Maimonides' 13 articles of faith is that at the end of times, the dead will be resurrected, mechayei hametim. This is in some ways astonishing, because Maimonides, the Rambam, was perhaps the most revered physician in Jewish history, whose writings 900 years ago synthesized Judaism and medical science in a seemingly quite modern way. As an empirical scientist and doctor who had seen any number of people die and decay, the Rambam's belief in the resurrection of the dead seems very much at odds with his rationalism and is a compelling statement of his belief that God's power exceeds the laws of nature. On the other hand, Baruch Spinoza, the great and very controversial 17th century Jewish philosopher, was exceedingly skeptical of mechayei hametim. Unlike the Rambam, Spinoza believed that God and nature are one and the same. God is neither transcendent nor outside of nature, but immanent and subject to the natural order. So to Spinoza, revelation, in which the word of God is communicated to humankind, is metaphorical only and not a literal event. The best way to know God, says Spinoza, is a path open to all human beings through their capacity to reason and observe, i.e., to investigate nature itself. Given these radical and revolutionary ideas, Spinoza could not accept the resurrection of the dead, which runs wholly counter to natural law. For this and other equally explosive views, Spinoza was excommunicated in 1656. But Jewish tradition also demonstrates some hostility to doctors and to medical science. The phrase, I, Adonai, am your healer, ki ani Adonai refuecha, in Shemot 15:26 has been interpreted to mean that God alone provides good health and recovery from illness, and that humans lack the power to do so without God's intervention. For example, King Asa, who ruled Judah in the late 19th century BCE, is criticized for an apparent lack of faith in divine healing. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa suffered from an acute foot ailment. But ill as he was, he did not turn to Adonai, but rather to physicians. That's in Chronicles. Similarly, there's a rabbinic legend that considered King Hezekiah, 7th century BCE, praiseworthy because following God healing him from a near-fatal illness through the intercession of the prophet Isaiah, Hezekiah, quote, hid away a medical book to encourage the people to turn to God and not to physicians for healing. And in the Mishnah, in Kedushin 4:14, it says, even the best physician is deserving of hell, something I have never said to my wife and never will. That's how you stay married for 40 years. The verse, I Adonai am your healer, also has been the basis for some modern Jews to reject, or at least to be skeptical, of medical science in the absence of spiritual healing. A notable example of this is the Jewish science movement, founded in New York in 1921 and still in existence. Jewish science, much like Christian science, to which it expressly responds, embraces a radical and singularly spiritual path to healing. Jewish science claims that, quote, our mental attitude, personality, and perceptions can have an impact on disease as well as dis-ease. Through meditation, affirmative prayer, and visualization, we have an opportunity to rise above that dis-ease to a place of greater recovery, healing, and peace of mind. More recently, Debbie Friedman wrote many songs expressing the power of spiritual healing through prayer and music. Of course, her best-known song, her Mishaberach, we sing every week. And so do Reform and even Orthodox congregations around the world. Friedman's work, among its many other strengths, restored the idea of medical bakashot, petitionary prayers, without negating the value of scientific medical treatment. These examples of spiritual healing as an adjunct or even as an alternative to medical science don't change the fact that, as exemplified in the story at the beginning of the drash, Jews generally have the deepest respect for medical science. The percentage of Jewish doctors in the United States is roughly 7 times that of our percentage in the total population, and more than a quarter of Nobel laureates in medicine have been Jewish. The Jewish community supports hospitals and medical research centers throughout the U.S., Israel, and other countries. And the Jewish community universally adheres to the Talmudic doctrine of pikuach nefesh, which maintains that the saving of a life takes precedence over all ritual requirements, such as fasting on Yom Kippur. But we also increasingly understand of the mind-body connection in medicine, and that a patient must not be seen just as a diagnosis, but rather as a whole person with physical, psychological, and often spiritual needs. In fact, roughly 85% of U.S. doctors identify with a religious tradition and recognize that faith, whether the doctors, the patients, or both, can be a powerful tool in healing. So to come full circle, the priest's role as would-be dermatologist in today's parsha may have been the first small step in millennia of deep Jewish engagement with medicine and healing. From Moses healing snake bites to Elijah and Elisha resurrecting the dead, or maybe just the near dead, to the Rambam's attempts to synthesize rationalism with faith, to Spinoza's revolutionary heretical ideas, to modern attempts to synthesize medicine with spirituality, and of course to the extraordinary contributions of Jewish doctors and scientists such as Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, among innumerable others, Jews and medicine have walked in lockstep over many, many centuries. For many people, the phrase, a Jewish doctor, connotes a synthesis of wisdom, compassion, and skill. So much so that it can outshine even becoming president. Shabbat shalom.